All right, so are you ready to talk some Alberta real estate?
Always ready to dive into this market.
I feel like every time we do one of these deep dives, the market has done like a complete 180.
That's Alberta real estate for you. Never a dull moment.
Definitely keeps us on our toes.
It does.
Well, for today, we're looking at the province's October 2024 data,
Fresh off the press.
hot off the press.
Yeah.
So let's paint a picture for our listeners. Is the market still like crazy hot? Is it finally starting to cool down?
Kind of a mixed bag right now, which I know is probably not the clear-cut answer people want, but the numbers are showing some interesting things.
Well, let's jump into those numbers then. One of the first things I noticed was that total residential sales are up almost 15% compared to this time last year.
Yeah, 14.8 to be exact.
Okay, but then you look at the average price, and that's jumped by almost 20% to over $544,000.
Yeah, and that's what makes it so interesting right now. You've got this increase in sales activity, so things are clearly moving, but at the same time, prices are climbing significantly.
Yeah. So is that typical for a healthy market?
Not necessarily. You usually want to see a bit more balance between supply and demand. When you have this kind of price growth alongside increased sales, it can be a sign that demand is outpacing supply.
Makes sense. Now, the report also highlights detached and semi-detached homes as being the big drivers behind those sales numbers. What's the story there?
It's a trend we're seeing across Canada, but it's especially pronounced in Alberta. I think after the whole pandemic experience, a lot of people are prioritizing space. They want that extra bedroom, the yard for the kids. And so detached and semi-detached properties are in high demand.
So it's not just condos and townhouses driving this market.
Not at all. Those are still popular, but that demand for detached living is really pushing the market right now.
So more sales, a strong preference for larger properties. That's going to put some serious pressure on the inventory, right?
Oh, absolutely. We're looking at a 3.4% decrease in inventory year over year, which essentially means fewer options for buyers. And when you factor in that sales to new listings ratio sitting at 75%, well, things get even more competitive.
Okay, 75%, that sounds like a lot, but break that down for us regular folks who aren't real estate experts. What does that ratio actually tell us?
So basically, for every 10 homes listed, 7.5 are being sold. It's a good indicator of how hot a market is. And that 75% means we're in a very competitive market where buyers often have to move quickly.
So definitely not a market for those who like to casually browse and take their time.
Not really. You might find yourself in a bidding war, which is becoming increasingly common in this type of market.
Oh boy, I can only imagine the stress.
It can be tough, that's for sure, especially when you're up against multiple offers.
Okay, and then there's another key metric that caught my eye, months of supply, which is currently sitting at just 2.4 months. Now remind me, what exactly does that number tell us?
So months of supply gives you an idea of how long it would take to sell all the current listings at the current pace of sales. A balanced market is usually somewhere between 4 to 6 months. So 2.4 months for Alberta tells us it's a strong seller's market, meaning properties are moving quickly.
Okay, so that's significantly lower than a balanced market. And I noticed that some areas are even tighter than that.
Absolutely. Grand Prairie and Red Deer, for instance,
Yeah.
they're at just 1.52 and 1.69 months of supply, respectively.
Wow, so those are really tight markets, putting even more pressure on buyers in those areas.
Exactly. And those low months of supply numbers are definitely contributing to the upward pressure on prices.
So we've got a competitive market, low inventory, people paying a premium. What about price growth across the board? Is it pretty consistent, or are we seeing some big variations between regions?
It's mostly consistent with almost every region seeing year-over-year price growth. Calgary and Lethbridge are both at a respectable 16.2% increase.
But I'm guessing those aren't the biggest jumps?
Not quite.
Yeah.
The real standout is Fort McMurray, which saw a massive 31.3% increase.
Fort McMurray, wow. What's fueling that kind of growth up there?
I think it's a combination of things. You've got renewed activity in the energy sector, which is a major driver for that region. Then there's the factor of limited housing supply and possibly some pent-up demand from previous years. All those elements combined seem to be creating that perfect storm for price growth.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit and zoom in on some specific markets, starting with Calgary. Now, the report shows flat sales year over year, but a huge 55% increase in inventory. Yet the average price is still climbing up 14% to over $620,000. What's the deal there? Is Calgary bucking the trend?
Calgary's an interesting one for sure. That surge in inventory is definitely something to keep an eye on. It could be a sign that the market is starting to shift toward more balance, which would be great news for buyers.
So a glimmer of hope for those Calgary buyers.
Maybe, but the fact that prices are still rising even with that increased inventory suggests demand is still very strong. So it's kind of this push and pull between those two forces.
Okay, so maybe not a buyer's market just yet, but perhaps a little less intense than some other areas.
It's exactly.
Yeah.
Now let's look at Edmonton. They saw a massive jump in sales, 35%,
Yeah.
but at the same time, inventory is down a significant 24%.
Classic seller's market scenario playing out there.
Oh, absolutely. High demand, limited supply. It's the perfect recipe for continued price increases.
So Edmonton is riding that wave of economic growth and popularity, but with such limited inventory, how long can this frenzy really last?
That's the big question, isn't it? At some point, affordability becomes a major factor, and that could start to cool things down. But for now, it seems like Edmonton is still very much in that seller's market territory.
All right, and lastly, let's talk about Red Deer. It stands out as the only region with a price decrease down 3%. However, with just 1.69 months of supply, is this a sign of a cooling market or just a blip?
It's hard to say for sure. Red Deer's market is closely tied to the energy sector, so this dip could be related to some fluctuations in that area.
So those energy prices dip and Red Deer's housing market feels it.
In a way, yeah.
Yeah.
But even with that dip and those low inventory levels, I think it's likely prices will remain relatively stable. They may not see the same growth as other regions, but it's unlikely we'll see a significant drop.
So even with that dip, it's not suddenly a buyer's paradise in Red Deer.
Not exactly. It's all relative to the overall market conditions.
Well, it seems like we've covered a lot of ground already, but we've only just scratched the surface.
We've got a lot more to unpack.
Yeah.
So let's dive into some of the specifics for different types of homes. What are some of the numbers that are really jumping out at you from the report?
Well, when you look at those average prices for detached homes, even in Calgary, where we were talking about that increased inventory, the average is still over $658,000.
Yeah, that's a big chunk of change.
Yeah.
It seems like even with more properties on the market, the demand for those detached homes is so strong that prices are holding firm. What about the other cities? It's a similar story. In Edmonton, where we're seeing that really intense seller's market, the average price for a detached home is over $509,000. That's a significant jump from last year, and it just goes to show how competitive things are.
It feels like that dream of owning a detached home is getting further out of reach, especially in these hot markets. But I'm curious about the whole affordability aspect. With interest rates still being relatively high, how are people even managing to buy at these price points?
That's a really important point. Affordability is a huge concern right now for a lot of potential buyers, especially first-time home buyers. You've got high prices combined with rising interest rates, and that creates a real barrier to entry for a lot of people.
So even if you do manage to win a bidding war, you're then potentially stuck with these much higher mortgage payments. It's a tough situation for sure.
It is. And it's not just affecting new buyers. Existing homeowners who might be thinking about moving up or downsizing, they're also grappling with these factors.
Right, because if you sell your current home for a good price, chances are you're going to be buying in that same inflated market. It's a catch-22.
Exactly. And that brings us to the bigger question. Is this level of growth even sustainable in the long run? With interest rates being such a wild card, how do you see things playing out over the next year or so?
Well, it's always tough to predict the future, especially when it comes to interest rates, but it does seem logical that if they continue to climb, it could potentially cool down the market a bit. Those higher rates mean higher borrowing costs, and that could make some buyers hesitant.
That's a reasonable assumption. Interest rates are definitely a key factor to keep an eye on. But we also need to think about the broader economic picture. Alberta's economy is pretty strong right now, which is a major driver of this housing demand. But if we were to see any unexpected economic shocks or downturns, that could have a ripple effect on the real estate market.
So it's not just about what's happening within the real estate market itself. Those external factors can play a big role too. Now, what about the supply side of things? Are we going to see more new construction to help ease this inventory crunch?
That's another critical piece of the puzzle. Increased housing supply could help to moderate price growth and give buyers more options. But the pace of new construction is influenced by a lot of factors, things like labor costs, material availability, and even government regulations.
Right, so it's not as simple as just building more houses. There's a whole web of things that need to be considered.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that real estate is ultimately a local game. We might be seeing these broader trends across Alberta, but each city and town has its own unique dynamics at play.
It's not just one giant Alberta housing market. It's like a collection of smaller, localized markets, each with its own personality. And the report highlights some interesting data points for some of these specific markets. Like in Grande Prairie, for example, where we know inventory is super tight, The average price for a detached home is over $375,000.
That's a perfect example of how local factors can really shape the market. Grand Prairie's economy is heavily reliant on the energy sector, and that stability, coupled with the limited housing supply, is driving those prices up.
And then you've got Red Deer, where the average price for a detached home is around $363,000. It's lower than some of the other markets we've talked about, but still reflects that tight inventory situation.
Exactly. Even with that slight price dip, the lack of available homes is keeping the market competitive in Red Deer.
So regardless of where you're looking to buy, it seems like the takeaway for buyers is to be prepared for a bit of a battle. But what about sellers? Are they sitting pretty in this market?
Generally speaking, yes. Sellers do have the upper hand at the moment, especially those with detached homes in those high-demand areas. But it's not all smooth sailing for them either.
Really? Why not? I would think this would be a seller's dream come true.
Well, think about it. They might be getting a fantastic price for their current home, but when they turn around to buy their next property, they're facing the same challenges as any other buyer. They're back in that same competitive market.
Ah, I see what you mean. It's not as simple as just cashing in and moving on. They're immediately thrown back into that frenzy. It seems like the market is complicated no matter which side you're on.
It can be for sure, but it helps to try to put these numbers into perspective. Imagine you're a young family in Edmonton looking to buy your first home. With those average prices for detached homes exceeding $500,000, you're looking at a pretty hefty mortgage, especially with the current interest rates.
And on top of that, you're competing against potentially dozens of other eager buyers, all vying for the same limited pool of properties.
hmm
That's a lot to navigate for anyone, let alone first-time buyers.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But let's flip the script for a second. Imagine you're a homeowner in Calgary thinking about selling. Your timing is pretty good. You're likely to get a great price for your property, even with that increased inventory we talked about.
But then, as you said, you have to figure out your next move, knowing that you'll be entering that same market as a buyer with those same high prices. It's a tough decision to make.
It is. And it highlights the fact that everything in the market is interconnected. What's good for one group often creates challenges for another. It's this constant balancing act.
So, with all of that in mind, what does this all mean for the future of Alberta's housing market? Is this upward trend going to continue indefinitely, or are we headed for a potential slowdown?
If we zoom out and look at the bigger picture, it raises a crucial question. Can this level of growth be sustained? With the possibility of interest rates continuing to rise and affordability becoming an even bigger concern, it's not unreasonable to think that we might see a moderation in price growth or even a slight correction in some markets.
But on the flip side, Alberta's economy is doing well. People are drawn to the lifestyle and the opportunities here. So that demand could remain strong, keeping the market competitive. It really is a fascinating situation.
It is, and it's one of the things that makes following this market so interesting.
Mm.
There's so many factors at play, and it's almost impossible to predict exactly what will happen next. What are some of the things that are standing out to you from everything we've discussed so far?
I think what's really hitting home for me is just how much variation there is within the Alberta market itself. It's not just this one big thing. It's all these little micro markets, each kind of doing their own thing.
Absolutely. It's like we were saying earlier, we've talked about Calgary, Edmonton, Red Deer, Grande Prairie. They're all seeing these rising prices and low inventory, but the intensity and the specific reasons behind it are different in each spot. It's not a one-size-fits-all situation.
It really highlights the need to look beyond those big headlines and really drill down into the data for your specific area if you're thinking about buying or selling in Alberta.
Exactly. Don't get caught up in those generalizations. You need to get granular, look at the school districts, the proximity to amenities, future development plans. All those things can make a big difference in terms of value and how desirable a property is.
It's a good reminder that buying real estate isn't just about the house itself. It's about buying into a community, a lifestyle.
Couldn't agree more. You're not just picking a house, you're picking a place to live your life.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Alberta's housing market, what's the one key takeaway you'd want to leave our listeners with?
I think the biggest thing is just remember that Alberta's housing market is complex and it's constantly evolving.
Mm.
It's easy to get caught up in the hype or the fear depending on whether you're buying or selling. But the key is to approach those decisions with a clear head, good information, and a realistic view of what you want and what you can afford.
Well said. Knowledge is definitely power, especially when it comes to these big financial decisions. So do your research, talk to the experts, and be prepared for a potentially bumpy ride if you're thinking about jumping into the Alberta market.
And don't forget, at the end of the day, real estate is all about people.
Yeah.
It's about those dreams of finding that perfect place to call home.
Absolutely. Well, that's a perfect note to end on. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the wild world of Alberta real estate.
Always a pleasure.
And to all our listeners out there, we'll leave you with this thought. As interest rates do their thing and the market continues to shift, what factors do what you think will have the biggest impact on Alberta's real estate landscape over the next few months? Keep an eye on the trends, stay informed, and good luck out there.